Good morning, everybody. I hate to interrupt conversations that might be going on, but it is time to begin. Uh, we'll begin with a word of prayer before we get into our class. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that you've given to us. Thank you for those that are present here today to come together and study your word. Just be with our visitors today on their travels, and just thank you for the service they're doing in your kingdom. And just pray that you continue to be with them in the work they're doing for you. And be with all those this morning who are gathering together and just doing whatever kind of work in your kingdom, Father. We know that we can all serve you in different ways and just help us to serve you faithfully. Help us to clear our minds at this time of any cares and distractions we might have so that we can give our attention to your word, Father, and learn from it and apply it to our lives. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, this morning let's be opening up to Esther. We'll be concluding our study in Esther today, looking at this topic of God's providence. So we'll be spending time in chapter 9, and then we're going to go clear through chapter 10, the short chapter that is. So, yes, so here in chapter 9, Esther, the book of Esther is coming to a close. And what's really happening in this chapter is everything that's happened up to this point is being tied together. But more specifically, what the author of Esther does in this closing section that does extend through chapter 10 is record for his readers that what God's people ultimately gained after everything that had happened is victory. That's really what's happening here in chapter 9 as we see the victory of God's people after all they've been through. But so with that in mind, what I'm going to do today is take you on what I'm calling a whirlwind tour through chapter 9 and consider for ourselves two principles about how we can achieve victory in our relationship with the Lord when we rely on the providence of God to see us through the battles we face in this life and in those times we face opposition. So the first principle we'll consider from verses 2 through 19 of this chapter is that victory is achieved when we come together as one. And the second principle we'll consider based on verses 20 through 32 of chapter 9 is that victory is achieved when we remove our enemies. Now, following those things, we'll conclude our study today by examining briefly the three verses that make up chapter 10. Now, what we'll learn from these things, the application, if you will, is that when we rely on the providence of God, victory is ultimately ours. So with that in mind, we're going to be reading through the text, but at the same time, we're just going to kind of read as we go. But here in verse 1, the groundwork for chapter 9 is laid. It says, now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. Now, in this introductory verse to chapter 9, what the author of Esther is really doing is establishing a timeline for us as to when the events of chapter 9 would take place. And so, according to this verse, the events of chapter 9 take place at the same time that the Jews were set to be destroyed. Now, earlier in the book, this was the day and time that the execution of the Jews was about to take place. But now the tables have turned. The situation is completely reversed. The Jews have been given authority to take vengeance on their enemies, to destroy anyone who would oppose them, and that's something we looked at last time. So since that's true, verse 1 sets the theme for everything that is recorded in chapter 9 about how God's people would gain victory over their enemies. Now, I think something else we should be reminded of here is that the month Adar, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, this falls sometime in March. So this would be early spring that these events would be taking place. Any questions on verse 1? Okay. So this will brings us into the first principle we're going to look at, and that is that victory is achieved when we come together. Now, this section really begins in verses 2 and 3. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 2 and 3, we'll go ahead and read those. Oh, wait, are you in chapter? We're in chapter 9. Sorry. Yeah. Verses 2 and 3, yes. All right, we'll pause there. Thank you. So, again, we're looking at this principle that victory is achieved when we come together. Now, when you read verses 2 and 3, what's the picture being painted there? When you read verses 2 and 3, what's the picture being painted there? They gathered together. Who gathered together? The Jews. And does anyone else get involved in this coming together? Right. So the leaders were in support of the Jews. So you have all these people coming together, primarily the Jews, absolutely. But there were also some non-Jews in the mix. And so what the author notes for us in these verses is that much of the non-Jews, they came together for the purpose of defending themselves. But what we also see in these verses is that much of the reason the non-Jews assisted the Jews is because of fear. At least the New American Standard uses the word dread. But who were the non-Jews afraid of? Mordecai. Why? Okay, they knew God was with him. Yes, and that's a lot of the perspective that non-Jews had on the Jews. They knew somebody was taking care of them. You see that all through the Old Testament. Go ahead, Andrea. Right. Absolutely right. At this point in the story, Mordecai is now number 2, just under the king, in a position of authority. So so there's this fear that's created in those who are not Jews. And so they say, well, instead of standing against them, I'm going to join them and help them in whatever way I can. The text says no one could stand before them. There was no way at this point in the story that the Jews were going to be defeated. And yes, ultimately, that's because God was behind them. Now, I've said this multiple times throughout our classes, but the name of God is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. But you do see him working behind the scenes in all these events. Anything else on verses 2 and 3? Okay. So the next chunk of text we're going to look at, with 2 and 3 having set the stage, is verses 4 through 10. I'll go ahead and read that. There's a lot of names there. It says, "Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, in Parshandatha, Dalphon, Ashbetha, Portha, Adalia, Eridatha, Parmashta, Erisai, Eridai, and Vaizala. the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now, in short, what we read in verses 4 through 10 is really how victorious the Jews were over their enemies. Because when we read these verses, this is a summarized, not an exhaustive list, but really a summarized list of all the Jews the enemies destroyed. Now, there in verses 8 through 10, 7 through 10, I should say, who was among these enemies that the Jews destroyed? The 10 sons of Haman. That's significant. I mean, this is all significant, but among them was the 10 sons of Haman. Now, also, something else we should note here is in verses 6 through 10, the emphasis seems to be on how many of the Jews were defeated in the citadel of Susa. That was the capital of the Persian Empire, but yes, among them was the 10 sons of Haman. Now, according to these verses, based on the end of verse 10, what did the Jews not do? Take their plunder. What's plunder? Spoils of the war. Stuff of the enemy that you can take in most circumstances. Now, why didn't the Jews do that? Let's just explore some reasons. Okay. Okay, so yes, it wasn't to make gain. Any other ideas? Okay, maybe they want to leave the families destitute. Um, Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, I'm not fishing for an answer here. I'm just trying to pick people's brains. So yes, those are some. What's that? Well, it might be what God had in mind. Well, that's why I'm asking this question. Because yes, under the Persian edict that was issued, they were authorized to take the plunder. They could have done it. But the text obviously says they didn't. So we have to ask why. That's why I'm asking this question. The text doesn't tell us. But one commentator suggests that one possible reason is because of what happened in the text of 1 Samuel 15, 17 through 23. We're not going to go there because we just don't have time. But in that text, in the context of that text, I should say first, King Saul was sent to destroy one of the enemies. God said, don't take the stuff. Now, I'm just putting in simple English there. But King Saul, he thought he knew better. He takes the stuff. So this commentator is saying, well, maybe the Jews had this in mind. Well, look what happened to King Saul. Yes, we're authorized to take this, but we're not going to. Yeah. And the Jews might have had some of that in mind. Anything else on verses up to verse 10? Okay. So, the enemies of the Jews are defeated. Now, that brings us into verses 11 through 15. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses for us. Thank you, Dean. So the Jews are defeated, or the Jews' enemies are defeated. Word gets back to the king. How does the king respond in verses 11 and 12? Okay, he's asked Esther, what else do you need or want? What else is recorded there as far as his response? Right, how many more died other than what have been counted? 500 people in Susa, Shushan, and some translations, plus Haman's 10 sons, or among them. So this is a statement of surprise. He's thinking, wow, if this many people were killed here in the capital alone, how many people were killed across the Persian Empire? And then that's followed up, as Don pointed out, with him asking Esther, well, what else do you want? What else can I do for you? Questions or comments on 11 and 12? Okay. So, what does Esther ask for in verse 13? She wants Haman's sons to be hung. Anything else there in verse 13? Okay. All right. So that's what we're going to discuss a little bit. No, you're taking us in the right direction, Dawn. You're fine. So yes, so she wants another day for this. The edict that went out only authorized for one day. But the king's saying to Esther, well, what else do you want? All this has happened. What else can I do for you? So she asked for another day. But also, as was pointed out, she asked for Haman's sons to be hanged. Now, what has the text already said about Haman's 10 sons? They're already dead. So why hang them? An example. To make an example out of them, as Don pointed out and was said over here again. So they're displaying their bodies, and so this is probably a way of showing, if you continue to oppose the Jews, here's what's going to happen to you. Yeah. Exactly. No. Yeah, the 10 sons of Haman were prominent because before Mordecai, Haman was in the number 2 position. So she asked for this. Now, with these things being true, well, let me ask you, how would you respond if you hear about Esther asking for this? Does that say anything about her? Okay. Okay, she wants something to be finished up and started. Any other thoughts? Okay, seem to be aware of what people thought. Okay. Okay. God is in charge, not him. So. Mhm. That's true. exactly. I mean, we can't assume that God's people were in communication with him. Now, I bring this up because some have accused Esther of cruelty here. They've already massacred all these people in one day. Why is she asking for an extra day? But what's possible here is that the reason Esther makes this request is because there were still enemies that were not yet defeated. As Don pointed out, there was still a job to be done. But what we should also notice in these verses is that in verse 15, what does the author repeat? At the end of verse 15, what did they not do? Did not lay their hands on the plunder. Again. So yes, we can assume there's something about what God wanted in all of this going on. But again, that's just an assumption we can make. Yeah. Yeah, they were after justice and yeah. Exactly. Exactly. This wasn't about material gain. This was about defeating these enemies that were ultimately of God. Yes, go ahead. That's exactly what's going on here. Yes. Right. Massacre is probably the wrong word. I apologize for that. So, right. Yeah. So that's why it seems that there was still a job to be done and why Esther requests the second day. Anything else up through verse 15? Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so this is what's happened to verse 15. Now, when we move into verses 16 through 19, what else are we told? What happened in the rest of the empire? Because up to this point, we're told about what's going on in the capital. Verses 16 through 19 moves to the rest of the empire. Yeah. So it says, the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. And then again, for the third time, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. That was done on the 13th day. What happened on the 14th day of this month, Adar? They rested. They feasted and rejoiced. So this killing on the second day happened only in the capital. But in the rest of the empire, they said, we're just going to take time and celebrate. Now, the Jews in the empire were not commanded necessarily to do what was done in the capital. So they didn't have to go out and defend themselves on the 14th day. So they'd celebrate, enjoy meals, just have a party, basically. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So putting verses 2 through 19 together, the principle we should see here about victory for God's people is that victory is achieved when we come together. That's the main thrust of these verses. The Jews, they came together as one. We call that unity. They came together in order to face their enemies with the providence of God behind them. And so the application of that to us is that if we want victory over what it is that might be opposing us, unity is critical. You have to have that in place. Why is unity so important? Oh, come on. I know you have thoughts. Can't do it by yourself? Why else is unity important in the face of opposition? It would be chaos. Okay? So, yes, it would be chaos. Instead of fighting the enemy, we're fighting amongst ourselves when that unity is not there. And that what that ultimately results in is defeat rather than victory. So that brings us into verses 20 through 32. Again, we're going to break it down in chunks. Okay. That's a good illustration of why unity is important. Um, so that brings us into verses 20 through 32. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 20 through 22, we'll start with that. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so what does Mordecai do in verse 20 through 22? Let's call this a holiday from now on. So yes, he records what's happened. He sends out these letters and establishes a holiday for the Jews. And it's a holiday because this time was originally set out for the execution of the Jews, but now the tables are turned. Now, the reason these days were like this is for that very reason. It's just they were going to be destroyed. Anything else on verses 20 through 22? Yeah, it was their 4th of July, and this would be a 2-day celebration as well. So, in response to those letters, we see the Jews' response beginning there in verse 23 through 25. The Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Now, as we come to these verses, the first thing we should understand is that what is written here in verse 23 through 25 introduces verses 26 through 28, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, one reason we know this is because among the things that the author records for us in these verses is this idea of pur. Now, we remember from the story that Haman had cast lots to decide when he was going to destroy the Jews. And so that sets the stage for what this holiday would come to be called. Anything else on verses 23 through 25? Okay. So coming into verses 26 through 28, beginning there in verse 26, what was the holiday officially called? Purim or Purim. I don't know the correct pronunciation. Yeah. So now what word is there in the word Purim that was used in 23 through 25? Pur. And what does that word mean? the lot, as in the casting of lots. So, and in the Hebrew, Purim is the plural of Pur. So, with this in mind, then, following the mention of the holiday's name, in verse 26 and 27, the author records the nature of this holiday. Now, what would occur on this holiday based on verses 26 and 27? Rejoicing. This was a 2-day celebration. But they're obligated to do this. Mordecai is basically instituting a law here. And this was a memorial of sorts to remember the victory they gained. Now, go ahead. Mhm. Absolutely, yeah. And so absolutely. And that's what I was getting ready to say is this holiday of Purim in the Jewish religion still celebrated today. And Jews still celebrate this day because this is a very significant event in Jewish history. As Mom pointed out, this was going to be a time when they were going to be destroyed, but the tables turned and they gained victory. That's something to celebrate and remember. Anything else up to this point before we get into verse 29 through 32? Okay. Now, in verses 29 through 32, the chapter concludes with Esther, with her authority as queen, confirming what Mordecai had written about the festival of Purim. Now, we read about another letter here. We'll just read the verses. It says, Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Okay, now as we come to these verses again, I think the first thing we should understand here is that what is contained in verses 29 through 32 seems to be a summarized record of a second letter written by Esther. Now Mordecai, he's written a letter. But now Esther writes a second letter to confirm the establishment of Purim. Now, one reason we can assume this is because in the book of Esther, there's a total of 4 letters that we read about. Letter number 1, Esther 3, verse 13, where Haman wrote a letter that the Jews were to be destroyed. Letter number 2, a letter written by Mordecai in Esther 8, 9 through 13, where Mordecai basically reversed Haman's letter from chapter 3, and that would lead to the salvation of the Jews. Letter number 3, here in verses 20 through 22 of chapter 9. And now the 4th letter is the one written by Esther. So those little details should put in our minds that the second letter was after the first letter Mordecai had written confirming or dealing with Purim. But now Esther, using her authority as queen, saying the Jews need to do this. Now, if that's the case, if that's the sequence of the letters, then what is said in verse 29 refers to the fact that Esther added her authority to the letter of Mordecai. Now, with that being true, there's something else that we read about there in verse 31. It says, again, I'll just read it again, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times of fasting and lamentations. Now, if this is still dealing with Purim, what does the end of verse 31 indicate about what would occur during the celebration of Purim? All right, and mourning. So it seems there's a combination of celebration and a little bit of mourning. We don't know why, but it's possibly because of the circumstances that would lead up to how the tables were turned. The Jews were set to be destroyed. That would be a mourning situation. But then the tables are turned, that celebration. So Esther, what she seems to be doing here is just adding more customs as to how to celebrate the holiday of Purim. Questions or comments on that? I know it's a lot of information. Okay. Yeah, I think that's also in the text when we read through. Right. Hmm. Yes. Yeah, I mean, we can be guilty of that, not passing things on to our children. Um, so, anything else? All right. So, applying this to victory for God's people, we can achieve victory when our enemies are removed. Now, verses 20 through 32, among other things, is a record of how the Jews gained complete victory over their enemies. Not partial victory, but complete victory. And that resulted, at the instruction of Mordecai and Esther, establishing this 2-day holiday called Purim to remember what had occurred over those 2 days of destroying their enemies. And so what we read here shows us that true victory is achieved when we effectively and thoroughly deal with those who oppose us. And that's a time for celebration. When we achieve that victory, when we stand up in that unified fashion to those who oppose us. And that brings us into chapter 10. Anything else on chapter 9 before we examine chapter 10 quickly? Yes, that's a historical setting. Correct. No, he didn't. Exactly. And when we see the prophecies concerning their captivity, we see that there's a bad time coming for you, but there's a good time following that. God would eventually bring his people back. Um, Anything else on chapter 9 before we survey chapter 10? Okay. Now, chapter 10. The book is closed with a brief account concerning the lives of King Ahasuerus and Mordecai. It says, now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. Now, beginning there in verse 1, what did the king do after all these events? He taxed them. That's what the text says. Now, And this went all across the Persian Empire. Now, we can't know why the author chooses to record this, but one possible reason is because he wants to inform his readers that the king benefited from all these things that took place. And from all the things that took place in the book of Esther, because it was partially through him that God worked to bring about the salvation of his people. Now, God works through people who aren't his people, but he does that to bring about good for his people. So this is a case where he worked through the king. Now, he worked through Mordecai and all these other people for sure, but the king was also involved. A lot of the things that took place in Esther could not have taken place without the king's authority. And God allowed that. But as a result of these things, the author of Esther goes on to record for us not only the greatness of the king, but also the greatness of Mordecai. And the text says that his greatness was recorded in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Now, can anyone remind me what those chronicles are? What book of the Bible bears this same name? Books, I should say. And of what nature are those books? What do those books contain? History. History about who? The kings. So this Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia, it's the same kind of book. It's a record of the kings that had, of the things they did. It's the same document that the king read earlier in Esther where he found out about what Mordecai had done for him. Questions or comments on verses 1 and 2? Okay. Now what does verse 3 say about Mordecai? Okay. What else? He worked for the good of his people. So that's, go ahead, Andrew. Sounds like Joseph, yeah. So this is a section about Mordecai's greatness primarily. He worked for the good of his people. He had a good relationship with the Jews. Now what this tells us is that the purpose of this concluding chapter of Esther is to praise Mordecai for the things he set out to do for his fellow Jews, and to show that these things are recorded in this document, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. But this is all about victory. Victory is achieved when we come together. Victory is achieved when we remove our enemies. I know we're over time. Any other questions or comments? I would like to find out. It'd be interesting to read. I'm sure there's snippets of it. Anything else? Yeah, God took care of his people. Anything else? Hey, Dad, would you close us today?